We're at the epicenter of the initial outbreak. WA1, Washington 1, is considered the ancestral model strain. This center...
I developed the ancestral model strain. I created it.
That's right. You let it loose.
I was in my kitchen.
You let it loose. Yeah. Right. Okay. Gain of function. Here we come. You're making aranja, Italian meatballs, and that's a gain of function.
Okay.
How very, very strange, given the fact that COVID-19 has killed millions across the planet, over 1 million here in the United States. Yet the man who recently announced his retirement from federal service after 38 years as director of the National Institutes for Allergies and Infectious Diseases, that individual joked, yes, Anthony Fauci joked about making the disease in his kitchen. Let's be serious about the topic. Let's talk about what we can know 2+ years later with somebody who has been a stellar truth teller on the issue, a medical professional, the author of COVID-19. You've got to get the book, The Courage to Face COVID-19, Preventing Hospitalization and Death While Battling the Biopharmaceutical Complex. That man is Dr. Peter McCullough. Dr. McCullough, welcome back to America First.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the state. So I have very numerous specific questions I want to ask you with regards to the change in the CDC guidelines, then the latest news from the Pfizer studies and so forth. But first, let's have an overall snapshot, the state of science today. We have another cut from Dr. Fauci where he has a peculiar interpretation of the scientific method and his role inside the scientific establishment. Play cut.
And what I symbolize in an era of the normalization of untruths and lies and all the things you're seeing going on in society from January 6th to everything else that goes on, people are craving for consistency, for integrity, for truth, and for people caring about people.
Now, I'm sure there are large egos in the medical profession, but when you practice medicine every single day, when you were at school studying medicine, was there anybody around you who had the temerity, the audacity to say that I am truth and I represent integrity? Isn't this a rather unusual stance to take?
It's unusual, and we never do that. Humility is part of academic medicine. There is no such thing as someone holding the truth or untruth. There's simply scientific data, and there's two or more interpretive points of view. And then, in fact, the more points of view we have through scientific discourse, we advance our knowledge. And unfortunately, our public servant, Dr. Fauci, has not advanced the science. He hasn't engaged in experts in the field. He's never seen or examined a COVID-19 patient. And I think it's telling on his NIH notice that he's leaving his position, that after his years of service, there's no mention of COVID-19. His signature problem that he managed for the last 3 years, there's no mention of it on his departure notice.
That is fascinating. That is so very, very telling that the individual who was the presidential advisor during the pandemic doesn't mention it in his resignation or his departure statement. That I'm so glad you mentioned that. All right, so talk to us, if you will. What is the state, irrespective of that little video cut, what is the state of science today? I'm a political scientist. That's what my doctorate is. I'm not a empirical scientist. But the scientific method is clear. Whatever the branch of hard science is, you have theories, hypotheses, you test them, and if they fail, then you go back and you look at the hypothesis and you have to start from scratch. What is the status of the scientific method today? How many people have been cowed, unlike yourself, and now fallen into this idea of there is a politically correct narrative on a given issue, including a pandemic, and I'm just going to follow that narrative. Is that something that concerns you today, Dr. McCullough?
It concerns me greatly, especially when the narrative is false. and misleading. And we see fracturing of statements all over the place. Let me give you an example. For routine testing done on a weekly basis for COVID-19, every published study done so far shows that it has a yield less than 1%. And when it's positive, it's more likely to be false positive. The WHO in June of 2021 said, stop doing routine testing. Now it takes more than a year later. Our CDC comes out in August 11th of 2022, says no more routine testing. How many people at work, school, and travel were tortured with these nasal PCR tests, which were never FDA cleared for that use?
Yeah, let's put them up there. That we mentioned this already. This is the NPR, the National Public Radio's summation of the change in the CDC guidelines. Very strange that we have there the unvaccinated, Dr. McCullough, are now to be handled, to be treated, to receive the same guidance as vaccinated. But weren't we told for 2 years that that is not the case, that they must be shunned, they must be treated like pariahs, like lepers if you are unvaccinated? What is the explanation for this completely Janus-faced 180-degree reversal?
The data behind that reversal is that the vaccines, with the progressive mutations of the virus, have lost significant efficacy, if any efficacy at all. And all this vaccine discrimination that went on, I was shocked to hear the Joe Rogan interview with Aaron Rodgers, quarterback for the Packers, describe the type of vaccine discrimination that he faced in his decision not to take the vaccine since he was allergic to polyethylene glycol and he shouldn't take it. It was extraordinary what Aaron described, wearing wristbands, not being able to participate in certain activities, working out alone. Those who actually imposed vaccine discrimination owe a giant apology to all those who are victims.
I'm going to use a prompt from one of my colleagues, Chris Stigall, who hosts Salem's morning show in Philadelphia. And when I saw him tweet this, I think I heard him say this on his show, and then he may have put it on social media. He's not a doctor either, but given what we've experienced and what you've just said, and others that have come on this show have said, my personal physician and others as well, are we justified, Dr. McCullough, in even calling these things vaccines? We've had the phrase used here that they are better. Dr. Baric out of California said he called them therapeutic biologicals, that these are biologic therapeutics. Is even the terminology defunct?
Well, the terminology does not apply to these products. Certainly Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca outside the United States, and Pfizer, Moderna, because they're genetic technologies. They're actually gene transfer technologies, bringing foreign genetic material into the human body. Then the human body transcribes that into a dangerous protein, in this case, the lethal Wuhan spike protein. So in no way is this considered a traditional vaccine. And not only that, vaccines should be given no more frequently than once a year and should have at least 50% protection. And the vaccines now don't meet those standard acceptance criteria.
And wasn't there an expectation in past cases, past pandemics, diseases, that for a vaccine to be labeled as such or to be considered as such, with regards to the specific disease it protects against, that vaccination provided permanent or what was termed semi-permanent immunity? Is that not the case?
It's true, at least a year. And that would be a standard for a flu shot, for instance. Tetanus shot is 10 years. Hepatitis B, far more than that. Polio, far more than that. This idea of every 6 months to take a booster, or even a 3-part series, for children now, ages 6 months to 5 years, it's 3 injections just to get the initial series done. And then a few months later, boosters. This is far more like routine intramuscular genetic therapy than it is a vaccine.
But that is not how it was portrayed to the American people. It was portrayed as a vaccine. But we need to get to the bottom of everything that has been told to us that does not represent the facts and truly is actually a denial of science. The book is Courage to Face COVID-19. You've got to get it. The Courage to Face COVID-19, Preventing Hospitalization and Death While Battling the Biopharmaceutical Complex, by John Leake and Dr. Peter McCullough. His website is petermcculloughmd.com. Please go there right now, bookmark it. I'm Sebastian Gorka. You are listening to America First One-on-One. Never, ever miss an episode of our in-depth discussions with the true experts, with the newsmakers. Go right now to your favorite podcast platform. Plug in my name, Sebastian Gorka, America First. Subscribe. It's absolutely free. Give us a 5-star review. It helps with the algorithms. And do share the links so that we can get the truth out there. Dr. McCullough, let's go back to the question of vaccines and how they are generally applied, how they are processed into the system, and how they are used for medical purposes. This idea that... You mentioned 6-month-olds. You mentioned toddlers being vaccinated. Before a foreign substance that is a pharmaceutical is permitted to be sold and used in this fashion, what is the standard for testing if it is safe? What is the protocol? How long does it usually take to make sure that a new medicine is safe to inject into adults, let alone children?
The regulatory guidance for a vaccine is 2 years of observation on safety data. And then if it's a genetic product, it's 5 years. In cardiology, I can use some genetic products. One's called mipomersin. We used that for a while now, patirisan. These are small interfering RNA products, so we can use them, but they have many years of safety data to make sure they don't integrate with the human genome or reverse transcribe, make sure they don't cause cancer or birth defects. All of that was skipped with the COVID-19 vaccines, even though they were developed long before COVID-19, the crisis emerged. We know that the Moderna CEO, Stéphane Bancel, he was the billionaire CEO of BioMérieux. They built the biosecurity annex lab for the Wuhan Chinese lab by the CCP. So Stéphane Bancel was working with the Chinese back before 2015, and then he changed to Moderna. And then Moderna started working with the Chinese and the U.S. government on the Moderna vaccine. It was years in advance that Stéphane Bancel, the billionaire CEO of BioMérieux, a French company, they built the biosecurity annex for the Wuhan Chinese lab. He worked with the CCP. He changed companies from BioMérieux to Moderna. And then Moderna started working with the Chinese and the U.S. government in creating the Moderna vaccine. In fact, the NIH co-owns the patent with Moderna. And within 3 days of the U.S. announcing this was an emergency, Moderna already announced they had a vaccine within 3 days. The only way that could have been done is having the vaccine prepared in advance.
And the idea that the FDA that clears these products for use in humans is, to a large part, funded by the pharmaceutical industry. I'm not an expert in the licensing of drugs, but that would seem problematic to me, Dr. McCullough.
It's true. Conflict of interest, I think, is driving the FDA and its malfeasance at this point in time. It's not only direct payments from Big Pharma, but it's the jobs the FDA officials get after their tenure at the FDA. FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, when he left the FDA, he's on the board of Pfizer, and he's advising Americans to take vaccines. The FDA commissioner after him, Stephen Hahn, he joined the venture capital firm funding Moderna. So I can tell you the great concern here is that our FDA officials are really working for their next job, their big pharmaceutical or venture capital job after they leave the government.
And then the bivalent vaccine data. Talk to us about the problems with the data on the latest vaccines or therapeutics.
In an unprecedented move, the FDA now only has antibody data on the BA1 subvariant, which is extinct, so the companies aren't going with that. They have simply the BA5 and BA4 subvariant data, and it's going to be coming from rodents without any human data, just to see if antibodies can be induced in rodents. Antibodies are an unreliable surrogate of clinical benefit. So the anticipated vaccines that are going to be discussed this week that Americans may be faced or forced to take will have no clinical safety or efficacy data. It's unprecedented.
What is the realistic expectation as somebody who works in the field, who has to administer drugs, has to administer vaccines? What is the likelihood that after the pandemic, after the new CDC guidelines seem to reset everything to zero, that any of this can return to normalcy, that we don't have conflict of interest, and perhaps most important of all, that the person, the lay people like me, actually respect the authorities who stand up at a podium and say, you must do this in the interest of your health? Is it possible? Is it going to take 10 years, 100 years? How badly have we dented or damaged the system of public health, Dr. McCullough?
Credibility in public health has been, I think, irreversibly damaged. We're going to have to completely clean house. We're going to have to install trusted people from the very beginning who said that we could treat the illness, that we have to be cautious on vaccine safety and efficacy. No one's against vaccines, but they should have had a safety report once a month. It should have been only offered in the highest risk and then adjusted when we found safety problems. But to ignore safety, to be willfully blind, and then mandate this on the entire population, including children down to age 6 months, people losing their jobs. This has been a public health debacle.
Yeah. The book is The Courage to Face COVID-19. Order it right now. Preventing hospitalization and death while battling the biopharmaceutical complex. The website is petermcculloughmd.com. And don't forget that this show, all of the content that we provide, is available online as well. We are everywhere except on the fascistic, censorious YouTube platform, whether it is Truth Social, whether it is Twitter, whether it is Rumble, or we live stream all 3 hours of the show, then post all the segments with our special guests at rumble.com/Seb Gorka. That's rumble.com/SEBGORKA. Or you can find us on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, you name it. You can be assured of never missing a moment, a nanosecond of the show if you follow us on all of those platforms. And of course, we have our own website that cycles the show, the 3-hour show, through the day, 24 hours a day. If you've got insomnia, it's a great way to beat insomnia. That's SebGorkaStore.com, SEBGORKA, SebGorkaStore.com. Now, I know it may take a very long time to calculate this, but perhaps we can talk about orders of magnitude, Dr. McCullough, this idea of excess deaths. So the world saw what happened in China. President Trump, almost immediately in January, shut down travel from China, was accused of being a xenophobe, a hysterical racist, probably saved, hundreds of thousands of lives. But then we saw this overreaction. We saw the medical profession, or at least the public health policy, quote-unquote, experts, such as Niall Ferguson in the UK and elsewhere, say, shut it all down. The Chinese have the model. Shut it all down. The schools, the places of employ, the big ones that have the lobbyist interests in D.C., they can stay open like Walmart and Amazon, but everybody else, just shut them down. And then we saw what? I saw it with access to healthcare, the local hospital. You couldn't get in there unless you were having some kind of serious surgery booked weeks and months in advance. So if it was a regular checkup, if it was a colonoscopy or some kind of cancer screening, do we have a sense of not only the psychological impact, especially on the youth, of shutting everything down, of making social interaction forbidden, and then purely from the medical perspective, how many people died as a result of missed cancer screenings and so forth? Is it possible to say that those excess deaths are comparable in terms of magnitude to those who died as a result of COVID or who have been registered as COVID deaths, Dr. McCullough?
Well, let's take COVID first. A recent survey, 18,000 individuals published in the peer-reviewed literature by Baric and colleagues, demonstrated that those who were hospitalized, they were hospitalized because they did not receive early treatment at home. And so it was actually the suppression of early treatment, which we clearly note in our book, that was responsible for the hospitalizations and deaths that occurred. in the United States. And that could be upwards to, with the learning curve on how we learned how to treat the illness. 2/3 of those deaths could have been spared, 2/3 of the hospitalizations. That means 2/3 of 1 million hospitalizations and 10 million deaths were avoidable. Now we look at this penumbra of casualties from the lockdown measures and other things that were done. I published the first paper treating doctors how to treat the illness in August of 2020. And right after that was the Great Barrington Declaration that was signed by hundreds of thousands of doctors and scientists, put forward by Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, one of my frequent fellow contributors to Fox News, Martin Kulldorff from Harvard, and Sunitra Gupta from Oxford. The Great Barrington Declaration said, just protect the seniors, just apply high-risk protection measures to those at risk, and leave the economy going, leave everyone else alone. That wasn't followed, and it was catastrophic, locking down the economy and having people shelter in place who had no fundamental risk from the infection. Now you're right. We see mortality up across the board, every single category: cardiovascular disease, cancer, other conditions, neuropsychiatric conditions. It's a disaster.
Now help me, if you will, Doctor, with this clear trend in the suppression of early treatment. So I have a very good doctor. Before I caught COVID in the December of the outbreak, I was on prophylactic hydroxychloroquine. As soon as I caught it, my doctor was looking after me. But the doctor, not the PA, the doctor who did my COVID test 2 days before Christmas and said, Dr. Gorka, I'm sorry you're positive you've got COVID. And I wasn't fazed by it. I ended up having, 3 days off work. I asked him, I was curious because I was sitting there and he was looking at me with a positive test result. And I said, okay, what do I do now? I was just curious. What is he? Because I know what my doctor was going to have me do, but what was this doctor going to have me do? And he said, oh, just go home. Where did that come from? Where did the idea that I'm not going to give you something that's safe like hydroxy or ivermectin, but you're just going to go home and maybe, 3 weeks from now when you're on a ventilator, maybe we'll give you something. Have you discovered a genesis for that suppression of early treatment?
It was in the minds of doctors early, some doctors, to not treat patients. But I recently testified in the Texas Senate, the Committee on Health and Human Services, on June 27th, 2022. And I told them there's always been a duty to treat or duty to refer in high-risk patients, and there's always been a community standard of care. And that's what the very first doctor and doctors did, as they did in your case, in my case, to provide some form of early treatment. And then the medications and the combinations evolved over time. But that community standard of care is very important. We've seen recently President Biden, Fauci, Biden's wife, none of them received community standard of care. They actually received Paxlovid, the new Pfizer drug, but against the CDC warning. The CDC has a warning, May 24th, 2022, says don't use it in the fully vaccinated. It prolongs the illness and causes rebound. They should have gotten community standard of care, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, plus the other drugs in combination, and they would have been through the illness in a few days.
Utterly, utterly shocking. Dr. McCullough, let's look at what I did, thanks to my doctor who understood what was efficacious, was doing lots of research from the beginning. Why? I dread to just have the knee-jerk, cynical reaction. It's all about money. But why was there suppression of tried and tested off-label drugs like ivermectin, like hydroxy, that we have been using for our soldiers since the 1960s, that is an over-the-counter medicine in Africa, which fascinatingly had a minimal COVID outbreak by comparison to other continents. Given the fact that I believe, 60% of all prescriptions in America are off-label use, so a patient is given a drug for something that it wasn't designed to treat originally, but has been demonstrably effective in treating that other condition. Why was there a war waged by the CDC, Fauci, state governance bodies, and even local pharmacists? I mean, the horror stories I heard of friends with legal scripts for hydroxy who had to go to 4, 5, 6 different pharmacists because they all denied that legal script. What was it? Just we want you to spend more money on expensive experimental non-vaccines. Have you identified with your colleagues what the genesis of that prejudice was?
You know, in our book, we identified the biopharmaceutical complex. This very well organized syndicate goes all the way up to the World Economic Forum, World Health Organization, CEPI, the Center for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, the Vaccine Development House, the Gates Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, Wellcome Trust, Gavi, the EcoHealth Alliance, NIH, CDC, FDA, White House Task Force. This syndicate had a plan, and the plan was mass vaccination. Anything that got in the way of mass vaccination, like early treatment, was going to be squashed. And it was very early on. Do you know in France, they took hydroxychloroquine off the over-the-counter market months before COVID-19 was even announced, months before. In Australia, they put on the books in April of 2020 that a physician would go to jail if the physician used hydroxychloroquine. I tell you, the syndicate knew hydroxychloroquine worked. And hydroxychloroquine, supported by over 300 studies, it's in 24 guidelines, as you pointed out, widely used across Central America, Equatorial Africa. Ivermectin, once we found the right dose and the right duration, a very dynamic drug, works early and late. The steroids had a huge impact, inhaled as well as oral steroids, oral aspirin, anti-inflammatories. There were protocols all over the world. Sadly, the only people who were hospitalized and died, they did so because they didn't receive treatment in the first 3 days.
Explain to me that decision from France and Australia. Are you saying that they knew in advance that new vaccines were coming for something called COVID, and that's why they banned the over-the-counter sale of hydroxy? Explain to me how that came about.
You know, no one knows what triggered the French government to do that, but I can tell you in 2015, there were papers published, first author Menachery, senior author Baric from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, funded by the National Institutes of Health. But these were U.S. projects. And the title of the papers in Nature and Proceedings of the New York Academy of Sciences was The Emergence of SARS-CoV-2 in Human Populations. They were working on the virus, getting it to invade a humanized respiratory epithelial tract in rodents. The work was done in Wuhan, China, but this was a U.S. government operation. And as Peter Breggin points out in his book, COVID-19 and the Global Predators, there were 36 pandemic preparedness planning events since 2012. 25 of which generated documents, 6 of which were filmed. This was planned, Dr. Gorka. This was planned. Hydroxychloroquine was going to be a wrench in the works of mass vaccination.
So what was the objective of the plan? Was it to make money? Was it to kill a lot of people? If you're saying all of this was premeditated, then with what objective?
You know, we've identified in our book that the crimes are fraud. The public's been defrauded by these agencies in this complex. And then mass negligent homicide, we think largely from the denial of early treatment. The motive appears to be the vaccines. And you know our government response has been on the vaccines from the very beginning. It was about a needle in every arm, in every person down to 6 months. What's being accomplished with these vaccines and why there is such a commitment to it, no one knows at this point in time. It's never been stated. You know, our agencies can't state why there is such a motivation to have these vaccines, which have lost their effectiveness and have never had a safety review. why there is such an impetus to have a needle in every arm. No one's actually ever explained it.
And if you had to guess, given that you've authored a book on this and you've been an outspoken critic of the public health decisions made in the last 2 years, what is your supposition? Is it just money? Is it an obsession with universal vaccinations writ large? What would your guess be?
I think we should take public utterances seriously. You know, a big prominent player in the biopharmaceutical complex is Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation. And Gates has said overtly in 2010 that it's going to be the decade of the vaccines. He's also said overtly the vaccines could be used to reduce the world's population. And I can tell you, CEPI, the Center for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, formed by the Gates Foundation and World Economic Forum, they said there will be a series of biological crises, and the answer will be vaccines. And CEPI has lofty financial goals in setting out mass vaccination for the world, one crisis after another. By the way, we have 2 official crises declared by WHO and the U.S. government, and that's SARS-CoV-2, but as well as monkeypox. So you can see this plan put into action. It is draining treasuries of funds with no congressional oversight, no accounting reconciliation. They found a plan to drain us dry.
I'm talking to Dr. Peter McCullough. The website is petermcculloughmd.com. This is America First. The title of the book is The Courage to Face COVID-19, Preventing Hospitalization and Death While Battling the Biopharmaceutical Complex. The accusation is a very serious one, that there was a planned aspect to all of this, even removing effective drugs from easy access prior to the outbreak of the pandemic. We need to see evidence of that premeditation and why it was beyond just Bill Gates' obsession with vaccination in general, which is well documented. But Peter McCullough, Dr. McCullough, last question I have for you is, I came to the realization, sadly, that the biggest problem we have during the pandemic is courage. And you have named your book The Courage to Fight. Will you explain to our listeners, our viewers across the nation, what it takes, what the toll has been on you personally, professionally, to buck the trend and to say, no, I'm not interested in narratives, I'm interested in the truth?
You know, former President John F. Kennedy said courage is the rarest of all qualities, particularly in the setting of a crisis when everyone is in a groupthink, everyone is insecure and they're following one another. And it does take courage to look at a fact pattern and use one's skill and intuition and common sense and arrive at one's own conclusions, even if they are counter to a narrative. You know, we've seen that with Novak Djokovic, with Aaron Rodgers, and with Kyrie Irving, notable athletes that said, you know what, this doesn't sound good. I'm not going to take the vaccine. I've already had COVID, or I'll get through it. And, you know, they've paid a price with discrimination and a financial price. So many individuals in Hollywood, professional athletes, and public figures have not had the courage to speak out and say that they don't like what's going on. I think that's a big problem. It's the lack of courage that's enabling this false narrative that's ruining America.
And what would your advice be to young doctors in your profession who are feeling that pressure and are tempted to just keep their heads down, Dr. McCullough?
It's not going to go away on its own. The doctors are key in bringing America out of this crisis. The doctors must come forward now and recognize the vaccines are causing large numbers of injuries, disabilities, and deaths, and no doctor can stand by and let this happen on their watch.
Follow the man at his website, petermcculloughmd.com. The book is The Courage to Face COVID-19, Preventing Hospitalization and Death While Battling the Biopharmaceutical Complex. I'm Sebastian Gorka. This is America First.